The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Davidson as Sarah Martinez stepped out of the transport vehicle. Her boots hit the ground with quiet confidence, though her heart raced slightly faster than usual. She adjusted her standard-issue uniform and grabbed her duffel bag, taking in the sprawling military base that would be her temporary home. At 28, Sarah had seen more military installations than most soldiers twice her age. But this assignment was different. She had volunteered for this particular posting, though the reasons remained locked away in classified files that only a handful of people could access. To everyone at Fort Davidson, she was just another new recruit transferred in from a smaller base in Nevada. The base bustled with activity as soldiers went about their morning routines. Groups of cadets jogged past in formation, their synchronized footsteps echoing off the concrete buildings. Sarah observed everything with careful eyes, noting the dynamics between different ranks, the way junior officers interacted with their superiors, and most importantly, how the male soldiers treated their female counterparts. She made her way to the administrative building, where Sergeant Johnson, a weathered man in his 40s, processed her paperwork with mechanical efficiency. His eyes barely lifted from the forms as he spoke. "Martinez, Sarah, reporting from Fort Carson," he read aloud. "You'll be assigned to Charlie Company, 3rd Platoon, Barracks 12, Bed 23. He stamped several documents with more force than necessary. "Orientation starts at 800 tomorrow. Don't be late." "Yes, Sergeant," Sarah replied, maintaining the perfect tone of a respectful subordinate. As she walked toward her assigned barracks, Sarah passed the mess hall where loud laughter erupted from a table near the windows. 6 cadets sat around the table, their conversation animated and boisterous. She recognized the type immediately. The kind of soldiers who believed their upcoming graduation from officer training school made them superior to enlisted personnel, especially new arrivals. The leader of the group was Cadet Michael Thompson, a tall, broad-shouldered young man from Texas, whose father had served as a colonel before retiring. Thompson carried himself with the arrogance that came from believing his family's military legacy guaranteed his own success. Beside him sat Cadet James Wright, whose nervous laughter suggested he was more follower than leader, and Cadet Kevin Ross, whose reputation for inappropriate comments about female soldiers had already reached Sarah's ears through carefully placed sources. "Look what we got here," Thompson said as Sarah walked past their table. His voice carried just loud enough for her to hear, though she continued walking without acknowledging the comment. "Fresh meat reporting for duty," Wright snickered, while Ross made a comment under his breath that caused the entire table to erupt in laughter. Sarah's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but her pace remained steady. She had dealt with worse than these amateur bullies, and their behavior was exactly what she had come to investigate. The barracks proved to be standard military housing, long rows of beds separated by tall lockers, with small windows that let in streams of afternoon sunlight. Sarah found bed 23 and began unpacking her belongings with methodical precision. She had packed carefully for this assignment, ensuring that nothing in her personal effects would reveal her true purpose at Fort Davidson. Her bunkmate turned out to be Private Jessica Chen, a quiet young woman from California who had been at the base for 3 months. Jessica watched nervously as Sarah organized her gear. "You picked an interesting time to arrive," Jessica said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "The cadets have been particularly difficult lately, especially Thompson's group." Sarah looked up from her unpacking. "Difficult how?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably on her bed. "They think because they're about to become officers, they can treat enlisted personnel however they want, especially the women. Last week, they cornered Private Rodriguez in the supply room and made her count inventory 3 times because they said she looked like she needed the practice." "Did she report it?" "To who?" Jessica's laugh held no humor. "Thompson's dad knows half the brass on this base. Rodriguez tried to file a complaint once about harassment, and suddenly she found herself on kitchen duty for 2 weeks straight. Sarah filed this information away carefully. The intelligence reports had hinted at a culture of harassment and abuse, but hearing it confirmed from someone living it daily added weight to her mission. She continued unpacking, allowing Jessica to share more details about life at Fort Davidson. That evening, Sarah made her way to the mess hall for dinner. She chose a table near the back, positioning herself where she could observe the room's dynamics while appearing to mind her own business. The food was typical military fare, edible but unremarkable, and she ate slowly while watching the interactions around her. Thompson's group occupied their usual table near the windows, their voices rising and falling with bursts of laughter that seemed designed to draw attention. Sarah noticed how other soldiers, particularly the women, gave them a wide berth. The few female soldiers in the mess hall sat together at tables far from the cadets, their conversations quiet and watchful. As Sarah finished her meal, she became aware that Thompson's group had noticed her. Their glances in her direction became more frequent and deliberate, and she caught fragments of their conversation that confirmed she had become their next target of interest. "New girl thinks she's hot stuff," Ross said, his voice carrying across the room. "Maybe she needs a proper welcome to Fort Davidson," Thompson replied, his tone suggesting the welcome would be anything but friendly. Sarah cleared her tray and left the mess hall, but she could feel their eyes following her. She spent the rest of the evening in the barracks, reading a paperback novel while listening to Jessica's stories about the base's social hierarchy and the unwritten rules that governed daily life. The next morning began with orientation, a process Sarah had experienced dozens of times but pretended to find new and overwhelming. She asked appropriate questions, took notes like an eager recruit, and generally played the role of a soldier trying to make a good impression at her new assignment. During the lunch break, she found herself in line at the mess hall behind two of Thompson's group, Wright and another cadet named Davis. Their conversation provided valuable intelligence about the base's command structure and confirmed several of her suspicions about the harassment problem. "Captain Morrison doesn't care what we do as long as we don't make waves," Wright was saying. "And Lieutenant Hayes is too busy trying to make major to notice anything that happens with enlisted personnel." Davis nodded. "As long as we keep it quiet and don't leave marks, nobody asks questions." Sarah felt her blood pressure rise, but she maintained her neutral expression. The casual way they discussed their abuse of power revealed a system that had failed at multiple levels. These cadets felt untouchable because in many ways, they were. After lunch, Sarah was assigned to equipment maintenance duty in one of the base's storage buildings. The work was routine, but provided an excellent opportunity to familiarize herself with the base's layout and security protocols. She worked alongside several other soldiers, including Private Rodriguez, the young woman Jessica had mentioned. Rodriguez was clearly nervous around authority figures, jumping whenever someone entered the storage room and constantly checking her work as if expecting criticism. When Sarah asked her about proper inventory procedures, Rodriguez's hands shook slightly as she explained the process. "The cadets like to inspect our work," Rodriguez said quietly. "They say it's good practice for when they become officers, but mostly they just find reasons to make us redo everything." "How often do they inspect?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the extent of the harassment. "Thompson's group comes by most afternoons. They say they're learning logistics management, but—" Rodriguez trailed off, unwilling to voice her suspicions directly. That afternoon, as if summoned by their conversation, Thompson, Wright, and Ross appeared in the storage room doorway. They wore the casual arrogance of people accustomed to being feared, and their presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Well, well," Thompson announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Looks like we've got some new inventory management to observe." The other soldiers in the room found reasons to be elsewhere, leaving Sarah and Rodriguez to face the cadets alone. Sarah continued her work, cataloging spare parts with deliberate focus, while Rodriguez visibly struggled to maintain her composure. "Martinez, isn't it?" Thompson said, consulting a clipboard he clearly didn't need. "How are you finding Fort Davidson so far?" "Fine, sir," Sarah replied, using the respectful tone appropriate for addressing a cadet. "Just fine?" Ross stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way designed to intimidate. "We like our new arrivals to be more enthusiastic about their opportunities here." Sarah looked up from her inventory sheet, meeting Ross's eyes with steady calm. "I'm enthusiastic about serving my country and doing my job well, sir." Thompson laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "Your job well. That's interesting, because from where I stand, it looks like you're moving pretty slowly through that inventory." "I'm being thorough, sir. Better to be accurate than fast." "Is that so?" Wright joined the conversation, emboldened by his friend's presence. "Maybe you need some motivation to pick up the pace." What happened next would be talked about in whispers throughout Fort Davidson for weeks to come. Thompson reached into a small cooler they had brought with them and pulled out a can of beer. The act violated several base regulations, but the cadets clearly felt confident they wouldn't face consequences. "Consider this a Fort Davidson tradition," Thompson said, popping open the can. "A little welcome drink for our newest soldier." Before Sarah could react, Thompson tilted the can and poured its contents over her head. The cold beer soaked through her uniform and dripped onto the floor, filling the storage room with the sharp smell of alcohol. Rodriguez gasped audibly, while the three cadets burst into laughter. "Welcome to the real military, Martinez," Ross said through his laughter. "Hope you enjoy your stay." Sarah stood perfectly still for a moment, beer dripping from her hair and uniform. Her face remained expressionless, though something dangerous flickered in her eyes. She slowly reached up and wiped beer from her forehead, never breaking eye contact with Thompson. "Thank you for the welcome, Cadet Thompson," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "I'll be sure to remember this moment." The cadets exchanged glances, something in Sarah's tone making them slightly uncomfortable despite their bravado. But Thompson quickly recovered, his arrogance overriding any instinct for caution. "You do that, sweetheart, and maybe next time you'll work a little faster when we're observing." They left the storage room laughing, high-fiving each other as they disappeared down the corridor. Rodriguez immediately rushed to Sarah's side with a handful of cleaning rags. "I'm so sorry," Rodriguez whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "They've never done anything that bad before. We have to report this." Sarah accepted the rags and began cleaning beer from her uniform. "To who? You said yourself that complaints don't go anywhere. But this is different. They assaulted you. There were alcohol violations. This has to cross some kind of line." Sarah looked at Rodriguez with something that might have been sympathy. "Does it? Or will this just be dismissed as a harmless prank between soldiers, boys being boys?" The truth of Sarah's words settled over Rodriguez like a heavy blanket. In her 3 months at Fort Davidson, she had seen enough to know that complaints from enlisted personnel rarely resulted in meaningful consequences for cadets, especially ones with family connections like Thompson. "So what do we do?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah finished cleaning herself as best she could and straightened her uniform. "We do our jobs. We document everything. And we wait for the right moment." "Wait for what?" Sarah's smile was cold and sharp. "For people like Cadet Thompson to discover that actions have consequences." As they finished their inventory work in silence, Sarah mentally composed the report she would file that evening. Not through Fort Davidson's normal channels, which had already proven themselves compromised, but through secure communication lines that would reach people with the authority to act on what they learned. The beer still smelled strong on her uniform as she walked back to the barracks, drawing curious glances from other soldiers. Some looked sympathetic, others carefully avoided eye contact, and a few seemed amused by her obvious humiliation. Sarah cataloged every reaction, building a comprehensive picture of the base's social dynamics and power structures. In the barracks, Jessica took one look at Sarah's stained uniform and immediately understood what had happened. "Thompson's group?" she asked quietly. Sarah nodded as she gathered fresh clothes for a shower. "Apparently, it's a Fort Davidson tradition." "I'm so sorry. I should have warned you to avoid the storage rooms in the afternoons." "It's not your fault," Sarah replied. "And it's not something I plan to forget." As she stood under the hot water in the communal showers, washing beer and humiliation from her hair, Sarah allowed herself a moment of genuine anger. Not at the discomfort or embarrassment, she had endured far worse in her career, but at the systematic failure that allowed bullies like Thompson to operate with impunity. The cadets had made a critical error in judgment. They had assumed that Sarah Martinez was just another enlisted soldier with no connections, no recourse, and no power to fight back against their abuse. They had poured beer on her head, confident that their actions would have no meaningful consequences. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. That night, as the barracks settled into quiet routine, Sarah lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Around her, other soldiers prepared for another day of enduring a broken system, accepting harassment and abuse as the price of serving their country. But change was coming to Fort Davidson, though it would arrive in a way that none of the cadets could imagine. The woman they had humiliated with beer and laughter carried credentials that would soon turn their world upside down. The only question now was how long Sarah would allow them to dig their graves deeper before she revealed who she really was. The next morning brought an unusual tension to Fort Davidson. Word of the beer incident had spread through the enlisted ranks overnight, carried in whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Sarah Martinez noticed the change immediately as she entered the mess hall for breakfast. Some soldiers looked at her with pity, others with a mixture of sympathy and fear. A few seemed to be waiting for her reaction, curious whether she would file a formal complaint or simply accept the humiliation as part of military life. Sarah maintained her calm demeanor, choosing a table in the middle of the room where her presence would be noted by everyone, including the cadets. Thompson's group sat at their usual spot by the windows, their laughter slightly more forced than usual. Sarah caught Thompson glancing in her direction several times, as if expecting her to approach their table or make some kind of scene. When she simply ate her breakfast in silence, reviewing what appeared to be training manuals, his confusion was visible. "She's not going to do anything," Wright said, his voice carrying just far enough for Sarah to hear. "Told you enlisted personnel know their place." Sarah continued reading, but her pen made small marks in the margins of her manual. Marks that would have meant nothing to casual observers but served as a comprehensive notation system for someone trained in intelligence gathering. After breakfast, Sarah reported to her assigned duties in the motor pool. The work involved routine maintenance on transport vehicles, tasks that required enough concentration to appear genuine while leaving her free to observe the base's operations. She worked alongside Sergeant Williams, a career NCO with 15 years of experience, who had clearly seen situations like the beer incident before. "You handling yesterday okay?" Williams asked quietly as they checked fluid levels on a supply truck. "I'm fine, Sergeant, just focused on doing my job." Williams nodded approvingly. "Good attitude. But you should know that incident is being talked about at higher levels. Some of the NCOs are pretty unhappy about it." This was interesting intelligence. Sarah had wondered how far the cadets' protection extended, and Williams's comment suggested there were limits to what even Thompson's connections could cover. "Is anyone planning to do anything about it?" Sarah asked, careful to maintain the tone of a frustrated enlisted soldier rather than someone conducting an investigation. "Hard to say. Officially, it was just cadets being stupid. No lasting harm, no formal complaint filed." Williams paused in his work. But unofficially, there are people keeping score, and Thompson's group has been running up quite a tab. As they continued their maintenance work, Williams shared more details about the base's power dynamics. Several senior NCOs had grown increasingly frustrated with the cadets' behavior, but their options were limited by the complex politics of officer training programs and family connections. "The problem is proving anything that sticks," Williams explained. "These cadets are smart enough to keep their harassment just below the level that demands official action. Until yesterday." What was different about yesterday? Beer on base during duty hours. That's a clear violation anyone can document. Plus, Rodriguez filed a witness statement this morning. Sarah felt a surge of respect for the young private who had found the courage to go on record despite her fears. "Will that statement go anywhere?" Williams shrugged. "Depends on who's reading it and how much pressure gets applied from above." That afternoon, Sarah was summoned to the administrative building for what was described as a routine check-in with new personnel. She expected a brief meeting with a junior officer, but instead found herself seated across from Captain Rebecca Morrison, the company commander who had been mentioned in the cadets' conversations. Morrison was a woman in her early 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She reviewed Sarah's file with careful attention, asking standard questions about her adjustment to the base and her initial impressions of Fort Davidson. "I understand you had an incident yesterday with some of our officer candidates," Morrison said, her tone neutral but watchful. "Yes, ma'am. Some cadets spilled beer on me during an inspection of inventory work." Spilled beer. Morrison's expression suggested she knew the incident had been deliberate. "How are you dealing with that?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "I'm focused on my duties, ma'am. The incident was unfortunate, but I don't want it to distract from my work." Morrison studied Sarah for a long moment. "That's a professional attitude, Martinez, but I want you to know that my door is open if you need to discuss any ongoing issues. Sometimes problems with officer candidates can escalate if not addressed properly." "I understand, ma'am." "Do you? Because in my experience, soldiers who don't advocate for themselves often find their situations getting worse rather than better." There was something in Morrison's tone that suggested she was offering more than just standard support. Sarah sensed that the captain suspected there were larger issues at play, but lacked the evidence or authority to act decisively. "I appreciate that, ma'am. If the situation changes, I'll keep your offer in mind." Morrison dismissed her with a reminder that her performance evaluations would be closely monitored. A comment that could be interpreted as either supportive or threatening, depending on perspective. That evening, as Sarah walked back to the barracks, she was intercepted by Cadet Ross. He appeared casual, as if their meeting was coincidental, but his positioning suggested he had been waiting for her. "Martinez, right? How are you settling in?" Sarah stopped walking but maintained a respectful distance. "Fine, sir. Thank you for asking." "Good, good. Look, about yesterday, I hope there are no hard feelings. Sometimes military traditions can seem harsh to new personnel, but it's all part of building unit cohesion. The attempt to reframe harassment as tradition was exactly the kind of institutional gaslighting Sarah had expected to encounter." "I understand, sir." "Excellent. Because Thompson and the others were impressed with how you handled yourself. Shows character." Ross stepped closer, his smile not reaching his eyes. "In fact, we were thinking you might be interested in some additional opportunities to demonstrate that character." "What kind of opportunities, sir?" "Well, we're organizing a small gathering this weekend. Informal get-together for cadets and selected enlisted personnel. Good food, some drinks, chance to build relationships that could benefit your career." Sarah recognized the invitation for what it was, either an opportunity for further harassment or a test to see how far she would allow herself to be manipulated. Either way, it represented a chance to gather more intelligence. That sounds very generous, sir. Great. Saturday night, 1900 hours. The old recreation building near the south gate. Dress casual. Ross's smile became more predatory. Oh, and Martinez? This invitation is just between us. No need to mention it to your bunkmates or anyone else. After Ross left, Sarah continued to her barracks while processing this new development. The secret gathering represented either an escalation of harassment or an opportunity to document the cadets' behavior in a controlled environment. Either way, she planned to be prepared. In the barracks, she found Jessica and Rodriguez deep in conversation. Both women looked up nervously when Sarah entered, clearly uncomfortable about something. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, settling onto her bed. Jessica exchanged glances with Rodriguez before speaking. "Word is getting around about your witness statement," she told Rodriguez. "Some people are saying you're causing trouble." Rodriguez's hands shook slightly as she folded laundry. "Sergeant Baker told me today that my performance review might suffer if I keep filing unnecessary paperwork. He said some complaints reflect poorly on the soldier making them." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. The retaliation had begun faster than she had expected, suggesting the cadets had more support in the command structure than even her intelligence reports had indicated. "Did he use those exact words?" Sarah asked. "Close enough. The message was pretty clear." "Have you talked to anyone else about this?" Rodriguez shook her head. "Who would I talk to? Captain Morrison seems decent, but she's got her own problems with the colonel, and going above her head would just make things worse for everyone." Sarah spent the next hour listening to both women describe the complex web of relationships and pressures that kept Fort Davidson's harassment problem hidden from outside scrutiny. The picture that emerged was of a system where complaints were discouraged, witnesses were intimidated, and victims were blamed for disrupting unit cohesion. That night, after lights out, Sarah used her secure communication device to send another encrypted report. Her handlers needed to understand that the situation at Fort Davidson was more systemic than anyone had realized. The cadets were just the visible symptoms of a deeper institutional failure. The next 2 days passed with increasing tension. Thompson's group became more aggressive in their interactions with enlisted personnel, as if the beer incident had given them license to escalate their behavior. Sarah documented each incident while maintaining her cover as a regular soldier trying to avoid attention. On Thursday morning, she witnessed Cadet Right Corner Private Johnson, a quiet soldier from Ohio, and demand that he polish Wright's boots because his own work was substandard. When Johnson hesitated, Wright threatened to report him for insubordination. Sarah intervened by asking Wright a technical question about equipment maintenance, giving Johnson an opportunity to escape. Wright's annoyance at the interruption was obvious, but he couldn't openly object to a soldier seeking guidance from an officer candidate. "You seem to be around whenever there are issues with enlisted personnel," Wright observed after Johnson had left. "Just trying to learn, sir. I want to understand proper procedures." Wright's eyes narrowed slightly. "Maybe you're learning the wrong things, Martinez. Sometimes new soldiers get ideas about changing established practices." "I'm just focused on following orders and doing my job, sir." "Good, because soldiers who cause problems tend to find military life more difficult than it needs to be." The threat was clear, but Sarah simply nodded and returned to her work. She was building a comprehensive case against the cadets, but she needed them to continue revealing their methods and the extent of their support system. Friday brought news that would change everything. Rodriguez approached Sarah during lunch break with tears in her eyes and a crumpled piece of paper in her hands. "They're transferring me," Rodriguez whispered. "Orders came through this morning. I'm being reassigned to Fort Polk in Louisiana, effective immediately." Sarah examined the transfer orders, noting the unusual speed and timing of the move. Soldiers typically received weeks of notice for non-emergency transfers, but Rodriguez was expected to report to her new assignment within 72 hours. Did they give you a reason? Administrative needs. But everyone knows what this really is. Rodriguez's voice broke slightly. They're getting rid of me because I filed that witness statement. Sarah felt a cold fury building in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. The retaliation against Rodriguez confirmed several of her suspicions about Fort Davidson's command climate and gave her the evidence she needed to justify more aggressive action. When do you leave? Sunday morning. I'm supposed to spend the weekend out processing and packing. Rodriguez looked around the mess hall nervously. Sarah, I'm scared. What if they do this to other people who try to speak up? They might, Sarah admitted. But that doesn't mean speaking up was wrong. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that would accelerate her timeline considerably. Instead of attending the evening meal, she remained in the barracks and activated her secure communication system. The conversation that followed was brief but decisive. The situation has escalated beyond acceptable parameters, she reported to her handler. They're retaliating against witnesses and the harassment is becoming more systematic. I'm requesting permission to move to the next phase. The response came back within an hour. Permission granted. Execute at your discretion. Saturday evening arrived with unusual activity around the old recreation building. Sarah had spent the day observing the location and identifying potential security concerns. As she prepared for the gathering, she made sure her hidden recording equipment was functioning properly and her emergency communication device was easily accessible. She arrived at 1900 hours exactly, finding a scene that exceeded even her cynical expectations. The cadets had transformed the building into an unofficial club, complete with alcohol, music, and an atmosphere designed to intimidate and compromise the enlisted personnel they had invited. Besides Sarah, there were 3 other female soldiers present, all looking nervous and uncomfortable. The male soldiers seemed more confident. But Sarah noted the careful way they positioned themselves near exits and avoided drinking too much. Thompson greeted Sarah at the door with exaggerated friendliness. Martinez! Glad you could make it. Come on in and meet everyone. The gathering quickly revealed itself to be a combination of hazing ritual and intelligence operation. The cadets plied their guests with alcohol while asking probing questions about base security, personnel issues, and any complaints or concerns among the enlisted ranks. Sarah nursed a single beer while observing the cadets' methods. They were surprisingly sophisticated in their approach, using peer pressure and simulated camaraderie to extract information that could be used for future harassment or blackmail. As the evening progressed, the situation became more uncomfortable for the female soldiers. The cadets became increasingly aggressive in their comments and behavior, pushing boundaries to see how much they could get away with. The breaking point came when Ross cornered one of the younger female soldiers, Private Williams, near the back of the building. Sarah watched as Williams tried to politely extract herself from the conversation, only to have Ross block her path and continue making increasingly inappropriate comments. "Come on, sweetheart," Ross said, his voice slightly slurred from alcohol. "Don't be unfriendly. We're all military family here." Williams looked desperately around the room for help, but the other guests were either too intimidated or too drunk to intervene. Sarah set down her beer and walked over to where Ross was cornering Williams. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said politely. "Private Williams, didn't you mention you needed to make a phone call?" Ross turned to face Sarah, his expression shifting from predatory to annoyed. "We're having a conversation here, Martinez. Mind your own business." "Of course, sir. I just thought Williams mentioned something about family emergency earlier." Williams quickly seized the offered excuse. "Yes, that's right. I really need to check on my sick grandmother." Ross's face darkened as his opportunity slipped away. "Your grandmother can wait a few more minutes. We weren't finished talking." "Actually, sir," Sarah said, her voice taking on a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. I think Private Williams should attend to her personal emergency. Family obligations are important in the military. Something in Sarah's tone made Ross look at her more carefully. For the first time, he seemed to notice the confidence in her posture and the steady way she met his eyes without backing down. You know, Martinez, you've been causing a lot of problems lately. Maybe it's time someone taught you about military hierarchy. I understand military hierarchy perfectly, sir. The question is whether you do. The conversation had drawn attention from other people in the room. Thompson and Wright moved closer, sensing potential confrontation, while the other enlisted personnel watched nervously. "Is that a threat, soldier?" Thompson demanded, his voice carrying across the room. Sarah turned to face him with the same steady calm she had maintained since arriving at Fort Davidson. "Not at all, sir. Just an observation about the importance of proper military conduct." "Our conduct?" Wright laughed harshly. "You're a private who's been here less than a week. What could you possibly know about proper conduct?" Sarah's smile was cold and sharp. "More than you might think, Cadet Wright." The tension in the room was palpable now, with everyone sensing that the conversation had shifted into dangerous territory. The cadets clearly felt they were dealing with insubordination that needed to be crushed immediately, while the enlisted personnel waited to see if someone would finally stand up to their tormentors. "I think this party is over," Thompson announced. "Martinez, you just earned yourself a formal complaint for disrespecting officer candidates. Hope it was worth it." "I hope so too, sir," Sarah replied. "I really hope it was worth it." As the gathering broke up in an atmosphere of hostility and unresolved tension, Sarah helped Private Williams gather her things and escorted her safely back to the main barracks area. Behind them, she could hear the cadets already planning their retaliation. What they didn't know was that every word of the evening's events had been recorded by sophisticated equipment that would soon find its way to people with the authority to end careers and change lives. The cadets thought they had won another victory through intimidation and harassment. They had no idea that their real education was about to begin, and their teacher was someone they had gravely underestimated. Sunday morning would bring changes to Fort Davidson that none of them could imagine. Sunday morning brought an unusual sight to Fort Davidson. As soldiers made their way to breakfast, they noticed several official vehicles with government plates parked outside the administrative building. Military police officers stood at strategic positions around the base, their presence creating an atmosphere of tension and speculation. Sarah Martinez woke at her usual time, but unlike previous mornings, she didn't head directly to the mess hall. Instead, she took extra care with her appearance, ensuring her uniform was perfect and her bearing reflected the confidence she had been hiding for the past week. In the administrative building, Colonel Harrison, the base commander, sat across from two visitors whose credentials commanded immediate attention. The first was Brigadier General Patricia Santos from the Pentagon's Inspector General Office, a woman whose reputation for rooting out corruption and abuse was legendary throughout the military. The second was Agent Michael Chen from the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division, whose presence suggested that criminal charges were being considered. "Colonel, we've reviewed the preliminary reports, and the evidence is substantial," General Santos said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The situation at Fort Davidson represents a systemic failure of leadership and oversight." Colonel Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had commanded the base for 2 years and prided himself on maintaining discipline and order, but the evidence presented to him painted a picture of an institution where harassment and abuse had been allowed to flourish under his watch. "General, I want to assure you that we take these allegations seriously. If there have been isolated incidents involving officer candidates, we're prepared to address them through appropriate channels." Agent Chen spoke for the first time, his tone clinical and precise. Colonel, this isn't about isolated incidents. We're looking at a pattern of systematic harassment, abuse of power, witness intimidation, and retaliation against personnel who attempted to report violations. This rises to the level of criminal conspiracy. Criminal conspiracy? I think that might be an overstatement. General Santos opened a thick file folder and began reading from the top document. Cadet Michael Thompson, son of retired Colonel Richard Thompson, documented incidents of harassment against female personnel dating back 6 months. Use of alcohol on base during duty hours, abuse of authority to coerce enlisted personnel into unpaid labor, witness intimidation through threats of career retaliation. She flipped to the next page. Cadet James Wright, similar pattern of behavior, additional incidents of filing false reports against enlisted personnel who refused to comply with inappropriate demands. Cadet Kevin Ross, Agent Chen continued seamlessly. Sexual harassment, creation of hostile work environment, conspiracy to manufacture evidence against soldiers who filed complaints against him. Colonel Harrison's face had grown pale as the litany of charges continued. How do you have such detailed information? These incidents were never formally reported through proper channels. General Santos smiled coldly. That's because your proper channels were compromised. Colonel, when the normal reporting mechanisms fail, we have other methods of gathering intelligence. At that moment, there was a knock on the colonel's door. His aide entered and announced that the requested personnel had arrived. Colonel Harrison looked confused, but General Santos nodded approvingly. Send her in. The door opened, and Sarah Martinez entered the room. But the woman who walked in bore little resemblance to the quiet, deferential soldier who had been enduring harassment for the past week. Her posture was straight and confident, her eyes alert and commanding, and her entire presence seemed to fill the room with authority. Colonel Harrison, General Santos announced. I'd like you to meet Major Sarah Martinez, U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command. She's been conducting an undercover investigation into allegations of systematic harassment and abuse at your installation. The color drained completely from Colonel Harrison's face as the implications hit him. The enlisted soldier who had been dumped with beer, harassed, and intimidated by his officer candidates was actually a field-grade officer with the authority to destroy careers and file criminal charges. Major Martinez has been operating under deep cover for the past week, Agent Chen explained, documenting violations and gathering evidence that will support both administrative and criminal actions against the perpetrators. Sarah stepped forward and saluted the colonel, who returned the salute with obvious shock and growing dread. Sir, I've completed my preliminary investigation, and I'm prepared to brief you on my findings. Your findings? Colonel Harrison's voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah opened her own folder, revealing photographs, audio transcripts, and detailed incident reports. Sir, the harassment problem at Fort Davidson is more extensive than initial reports suggested. The officer candidates in question have created a systematic pattern of abuse that extends beyond individual incidents to encompass witness intimidation, retaliation against complainants, and possible conspiracy to obstruct justice. General Santos leaned forward. Major, please brief the colonel on the specific incidents you witnessed. Sarah's voice took on the crisp, professional tone of an investigative officer presenting evidence. On my first full day at Fort Davidson, I witnessed Cadet Thompson's group intimidate Private Rodriguez during an inventory inspection. The following day, Cadet Thompson deliberately poured beer on me during duty hours, violating multiple regulations and demonstrating clear abuse of his position. Colonel Harrison winced, as if physically struck. When Private Rodriguez filed a witness statement supporting my account of the beer incident, she was immediately subjected to retaliation, including threats to her performance evaluation and an emergency transfer designed to remove her from the base before she could provide additional testimony. The transfer was, Colonel Harrison began. Illegal, Agent Chen interrupted. Administrative transfers cannot be used to silence witnesses in ongoing investigations. That's obstruction of justice, which is a federal crime. Sarah continued her briefing with methodical precision. Saturday evening, I attended a gathering organized by the cadets at the old recreation building. This event violated multiple regulations regarding alcohol consumption, unauthorized use of facilities, and appropriate interaction between officer candidates and enlisted personnel. She pulled out a small recording device and placed it on the colonel's desk. I have complete audio recordings of the evening's events, including attempts to extract classified information from enlisted personnel and incidents of sexual harassment against female soldiers. General Santos picked up the recording device. This evidence will support charges of conspiracy, sexual harassment, creation of hostile work environment, violation of security protocols, and abuse of authority. Where are the cadets now? Colonel Harrison asked, though he seemed afraid to hear the answer. Military police are placing them in custody as we speak, Agent Chen replied. They'll be transported to the regional detention facility pending formal charges and court-martial proceedings. As if summoned by his words, the sound of raised voices could be heard from outside the building. Through the window, they could see Thompson, Wright, and Ross being escorted to waiting vehicles by military police officers. All three cadets were shouting protests and demanding to know what was happening. Thompson's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "This is impossible! I want to call my father! You can't arrest us based on the word of some enlisted nobody!" Sarah's expression didn't change, but General Santos allowed herself a slight smile. "I believe Cadet Thompson is about to receive a significant education about military justice and the chain of command." Agent Chen gathered his files and prepared to leave. "Colonel, you'll need to prepare a comprehensive report on command climate and oversight procedures. The Inspector General's office will be conducting a full investigation into how these conditions were allowed to develop under your command." "Am I being relieved of duty?" General Santos studied him carefully. "That depends on your cooperation with the investigation and your willingness to implement immediate corrective actions. But I will say this, Colonel. Your career is at a crossroads. How you handle the next few weeks will determine whether you have a future in the military." After the colonel left to begin damage control, Sarah found herself alone with General Santos and Agent Chen. For the first time since arriving at Fort Davidson, she allowed herself to relax slightly. "How do you feel about the assignment, Major?" General Santos asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "It was necessary, ma'am, but difficult to watch good soldiers suffer while I gathered evidence. Private Rodriguez, in particular, showed real courage in filing that witness statement." "Her transfer will be reversed immediately," Agent Chen assured her. "And she'll receive a commendation for her courage in speaking out against harassment." "What about the other soldiers who were affected?" "They'll all be interviewed and offered appropriate support services. More importantly, the command climate here is going to change dramatically. Colonel Harrison either gets religion about leadership and accountability, or he gets relieved and replaced with someone who will." General Santos gathered her materials and stood to leave. "Major Martinez, your work here represents exactly the kind of investigation that makes a difference. These cadets thought they were untouchable because of their family connections and the broken system that protected them. Today they learned that no one is above military justice." As the official vehicles departed, Sarah walked across the base one final time as Private Martinez. Soldiers she had worked with over the past week looked at her with confusion and growing awareness that something significant had changed. In the motor pool, Sergeant Williams looked up from his work as she approached. His eyes widened as he took in her confident bearing and the way other soldiers now showed her obvious respect. "So," he said quietly, "I'm guessing you're not really a private." "Major Sarah Martinez, Army CID, she confirmed. Williams shook his head in amazement. "Those cadets really stepped in it, didn't they?" "They certainly did, Sergeant. The question now is whether Fort Davidson can learn from this experience and build a better command climate. In the barracks, Jessica Chen was packing her belongings when Sarah arrived. Word had already spread that the mysterious investigation was connected to the new soldier who had endured harassment with unusual composure. "I can't believe it," Jessica said, staring at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. "You're really a major?" "I'm really a major, and I want you to know that your information about base dynamics was invaluable to this investigation." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I should have done more. I should have stood up to them earlier." Sarah sat on the bed they had shared for a week. "You did exactly what you should have done. You survived a hostile environment and you helped a fellow soldier when she needed it most. That takes courage." "What happens now?" "Now Fort Davidson gets new leadership, new policies, and a command climate where soldiers can serve without fear of harassment or retaliation. And soldiers like Private Rodriguez get to continue their careers without being punished for doing the right thing." That afternoon, Sarah received word that the cadets' processing was complete. Thompson, Wright, and Ross had been formally charged with multiple violations of military law and would face court-martial proceedings within 60 days. The evidence she had gathered would ensure convictions and likely result in dismissal from service and possible civilian criminal charges. More importantly, the investigation had revealed the extent of the command failure that had allowed the harassment to continue unchecked. Captain Morrison would receive additional training and oversight responsibilities, while several senior NCOs who had ignored complaints would face administrative actions. Colonel Harrison would retain his command, but under strict supervision and with the understanding that any future incidents would result in his immediate relief. As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Davidson, she took one final walk around the base. The atmosphere had already begun to change. Soldiers walked with more confidence, conversations were more open, and the fear that had permeated daily life was beginning to lift. Private Rodriguez had returned from her aborted transfer and sought out Sarah before her departure. "Major, I wanted to thank you," Rodriguez said, her voice stronger than it had been during their first meeting. "I was so scared after filing that witness statement. I thought my career was over." "Your career is just beginning, Private. And it's going to be everything you want it to be, because you had the courage to stand up for what's right." Rodriguez smiled, and for the first time since Sarah had known her, it reached her eyes. "Will you keep in touch? I'd like to know how this all turns out." "The Army is smaller than you think, Rodriguez. I have a feeling our paths will cross again." As Sarah's transport vehicle pulled away from Fort Davidson, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The investigation had been successful beyond her initial expectations. Not only had they removed dangerous individuals from positions of authority, but they had created an opportunity for institutional change that could benefit soldiers for years to come. The cadets who had dumped beer on her head, confident in their untouchable status and protected positions, were now facing the reality that actions have consequences regardless of family connections or institutional protection. Thompson, Wright, and Ross had learned the hardest lesson possible, that the military justice system, when properly applied, recognizes no favorites and offers no sanctuary for those who abuse their authority. But perhaps more importantly, Fort Davidson's enlisted personnel had learned that the system could work for them when brave individuals were willing to stand up against harassment and abuse. 6 months later, Sarah received an update on Fort Davidson's progress. Under new leadership and with reformed policies, the base had become a model for positive command climate and professional development. Private Rodriguez had been promoted to specialist and was thriving in her new role as a team leader. The 3 former cadets had been convicted at court-martial and dismissed from service. Thompson's father's connections had proven worthless when faced with overwhelming evidence of criminal behavior. All 3 faced civilian charges and likely prison sentences. But the real victory was measured in the daily lives of soldiers who could now serve their country without fear, harassment, or intimidation. The beer that had been poured over Sarah's head in mockery had ultimately washed away a culture of abuse and replaced it with the values that should define military service: honor, respect, and integrity. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected packages, delivered by people who appear vulnerable but possess the strength to change entire institutions. The cadets had thought they were pouring beer on a helpless enlisted soldier. Instead, they had poured it on a major in the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Command, and that mistake had cost them everything they thought they could never lose.